Hey there, my name is Shimite Obialo, founder and CEO of The Suites, which is an exclusive business community for executives and entrepreneurs of color who are navigating the C-suite. I wanted to kick off this conversation talking about a topic that's really been in the news a bunch lately, the topic of diversity in the boardroom. And for me, this topic is particularly resonant because I am a corporate attorney and have been in countless boardrooms where it was really apparent that there was a need for diversity. There was a need to have different perspectives around the table, and that really enhances the company and the value that the company is providing to its shareholders. So I wanted to have a conversation in particular because of something that I read about in the news. I don't know if you guys are familiar, but the NASDAQ has a new rule that they're proposing to the SEC that would require all companies that are listed on their exchange to actually reserve 2 board seats for diverse candidates, one for women and one for underrepresented individuals or LGBTQ individuals. In 2020, in the summer, with the murder of George Floyd, Breonna Taylor, Ahmaud Arbery, you saw this groundswell. You saw this activity that was derived from the Black Lives Matter movement. And you saw this momentum go from the streets into the suites. What I mean is you saw companies really taking a stand and saying, we need to do something about this issue of racial justice, and I have some role to play in this, right? I have something that I could do to move the needle. And so this is where you saw a lot of companies actually coming out and saying that we need to diversify our employee ranks, we need to work on retention and elevation of minorities in the workplace, we need to work on the boardroom. And there's been a lot of cool initiatives that I've seen pop up. There's a lot of people who've stepped up. Alex Ohanian, the founder of Reddit, he stepped down from the board and said, you know what, I'm actually going to reserve my seat for a Black individual to serve in this position. BlackRock, which is one of the largest investment managers in the country, said that they would not be investing in companies that didn't have at least one female on the board. And the CEO of Goldman Sachs at Davos said that they wouldn't underwrite any IPOs where the company had an all-white male board. So time and time again, you've seen companies step up and really make a stand in terms of diversifying the boardroom. So let's get into the rule itself, because I found it really interesting to actually look into the nuances of the rule. So the way that it works is publicly traded companies put together a proxy statement that is filed with the SEC. And they put together an annual report as well that is filed with the SEC. In these reports that are publicly available for anybody to look at, there is a requirement to detail your directors and to summarize their skills, their background, things that made them qualified to be a director. And the SEC does say in the compliance guidance that you can talk about race and ethnicity if that's something that was important in the company's decision to make that person a director. So there is some detail that is permitted, but it's not required. And a lot of investors, a lot of institutional investors, pension funds, they've been saying, hey, this is not helpful when we're trying to do our part in tracking diversity and making sure that we're invested in diverse companies. So these disclosures are not specific enough. And the NASDAQ really took heed of those complaints from investors, and of course this general groundswell and momentum that's leading towards more diversity in corporate America. And they said, you know what, well, we're going to actually put in our own rules that 2 seats be designated to a diverse candidate. And so the first seat must be reserved for a woman, self-identified woman, and then the second seat is reserved for someone who is an underrepresented minority. So that's Black, Latino, Asian American, Native American, and so on, or LGBTQ plus. The interesting caveat here is it's either you comply with this rule or you explain publicly, so on your website or in your filings, why it is you can't comply with the rule. In terms of timeline for adherence, so this is a proposed rule that's being put before the SEC. It's not yet been approved, but what the NASDAQ is recommending is that 2 years after approval, that's when companies have to have at least one diverse seat filled. And then 4 years after approval, they have to have both seats filled. So they have quite a bit of time to kind of get in shape. And then smaller reporting companies and foreign reporting companies do have some flexibility, and that's basically because a lot of times for smaller reporting companies, they just may not have the budget to go and hire an executive search firm, which is oftentimes what's required to find diverse candidates. So they may not have the budget to hire an executive search firm or even to increase their board composition, because board members for publicly traded companies are paid oftentimes. So there is some flexibility for smaller reporting companies where they can actually designate, I think, 2 female directors, and then they also have longer to comply. And then for foreign reporting companies, they've got some exceptions, because oftentimes what you find with internationally, you're looking at countries where you may not be able to fit the underrepresented minority. You may not be able to clearly define what that is. That's different for every country. And it may also be difficult because oftentimes countries, particularly in Europe, they don't like to categorize people by race and ethnicity. So they may not have that data. They may not have the right to collect that data under privacy regulations. So for a number of reasons, there's exceptions for smaller reporting companies and foreign companies. But this is the general rule, a comply or explain rule. And I was also looking at the fact that this rule has some resonance internationally. In Europe, you've seen the EU come down with some quotas that they're going to mandate for their member states in terms of having about 40% of the board composition be female. Different countries in Europe have already implemented some kind of a requirement that a certain percentage of the board be female. So I know Norway was one of the first. I think they mandated 40%. Germany, France, Spain, they've all got some criteria, some requirements. And even in the United States, California last year, 2019, did come out and say that any publicly traded company that's based in California state has to have at least one female director. And I think that criteria does escalate as the board size gets bigger. So this isn't completely new territory. This is part of a general zeitgeist. And so those people who are seeing it for the first time may be taken aback, but it actually isn't that far from what is becoming a trend and a norm in terms of corporate governance. My assessment of this new rule, the comply or explain component of this rule, is it kind of guts the thrust of it. If all you've got to do is say, I'm sorry, I couldn't get someone who was a person of color, I couldn't get a woman, I couldn't get an LGBTQ person, and provide some explanation as to why, and then that's it, I think that diminishes the value of this rule and makes it largely symbolic. The other thing that I found interesting was for the second board seat, the fact that it could be filled with either a person of color or an LGBTQ. I don't want to get into anything too controversial, but I think that that's overbroad. Many of us understand that the challenges for LGBTQ community aren't exactly the same for folks of color. Now, I mean, overall, the fact that this rule is weakened by those two things I mentioned, I think we can mitigate those things by the fact that the private sector has already stepped up and continues to step up when it comes to taking their own initiative. I mentioned that Alex at Reddit had stepped down. BlackRock has stepped up. Goldman Sachs has stepped up. There's other initiatives. Uber has stepped up with the board challenge, and many companies have signed on to this board challenge and really basically said that it's our time to do something. I'm standing up, I'm saying like, hey, I have a role to play. Legislating change, legislating a diversity mandate can only go so far, as is evident by the comply or explain and the overbroad nature of the second diverse seat. It is incumbent on private citizens, private companies to say, hey, I'm going to mandate something within my company. I also think that you follow the money. The fact of the matter is that a lot of investors are the ones that are pushing for diversity. And I think that is going to continue to be the thrust of where we see change, as opposed to change that is legislated from any kind of body on high. That's it for me. I'm curious to get your thoughts. Curious to know from you what you think of this new rule. Do you think that diversity in this affirmative action type of way is a good thing? Do you think that race and ethnicity and gender really matter in the boardroom context? One of the things I was thinking about, do you think that this rule is going to lead to a certain tokenism where companies are, in order to check the box, are basically finding, hey, let's get this woman over here, let's get this black person over there. They can be a yes man, so to speak, but they're not necessarily going to challenge the CEO or challenge the company in terms of creating some of that friction in the boardroom that is uncomfortable but is important when it comes to that corporate governance. Do you think that we're going to see like a concept of exchange tourism, where people are going to hop over to the New York Stock Exchange, which is the larger of the two exchanges, because they just feel like, I don't want to be told how to run my business, and I'm going to go the path of least resistance and least friction, where I'm not required to shame myself by saying that I haven't filled this diversity quota. If you're somebody who has sat on boards, whether that be public or private, nonprofit or for-profit boards, what is your take on this, and what have you seen be important in terms of diversity in a boardroom context? Hope to hear from you, and looking forward to the next conversation. Again, my name is Shimite Obialo, and this is Inside the Suite.